Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Martin Edwards on surveillance of the global economy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome every week here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, some noted expert on some important issue on the global agenda. Today I'm happy to welcome Martin Edwards, who is Associate Professor in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University, and this year Visiting Fulbright Research Fellow at the Balsley School and at CIGI. So welcome, thanks for joining us. And Martin, you're an expert on international political economy and specifically on the IMF. So I would like to talk to you quite a bit about the IMF. But let's first contextualize it. We've done some podcasts in the past here about the IMF and mostly about IMF reform and the role of the IMF, for example, in various international economic crises. But your specialty is more surveillance of the global economy, and I think many people don't fully understand the range of functions the IMF performs, some of which are quite different from the reason the IMF was created. So if you can back it up for us a little bit and just say, what the IMF started out as, what it's morphed into, and why it's still important.
Sure, absolutely. One of the functions the fund was created to do was to be a backstop for lending, but also to provide surveillance for countries. When they needed loans, they could get policy advice. Now, since the 1940s, that has morphed into an annual ritual, effectively, wherein fund teams go to each country and they essentially issue a report card about the country's economy. And that report card will talk about economic forecasts, it will talk about some potential areas of risk, and it will inevitably make some policy recommendations. And so what's interesting is that increasingly a lot of this work is now publicly available, which is a stark contrast to the early 90s, in which this ritual process unfolded in a very opaque fashion.
So the surveillance itself took the form of a report written by IMF staffers. And who would these people be? Would they be economists? Would they be policy analysts?
They'd be almost exclusively economists.
Right.
And so they're sent to sort of get a sense of where the country is and where the country is going.
And what do they look at? It's fiscal policy, monetary policy, markets, regulation, what kinds of things?
It's an assortment of things, actually. I mean, the fund's main focus is the balance of payments, but that inevitably involves discussions about fiscal policy and monetary policy as it pertains to the balance of payments. There's a whole host of sort of social issues or regulatory issues that the fund tends not to talk about. It will talk about unemployment occasionally, but its main focus is making sure that the country is growing.
And who would they interact with typically in these countries? Finance ministries or?
Yeah, they're all officials. So they're often heads of central bank, they're members of the Treasury Department or the Finance Ministry. Occasionally, they might talk to legislators, though that's pretty rare.
And these reports, are they digestible for the non-technical specialist, or are they highly technical?
Well, like anything that's involving economics, there are some startup costs involved in getting a sense of what's a current account deficit. So there's a lot of terms that are assumed. The fund has tried really hard to streamline these to make them more digestible, because no one thinks that they want to sit down and read a 90-page document about the Russian economy, for example. They tried to make it more.
And how often do these things get reported in the news?
Well, they get reported in the news, it's supposed to be on an annual basis, but they don't always reach the newspapers. There's one such visit that just wrapped up here in Canada, and so there was a discussion in the Canadian press about it. But a similar process unfolded last summer in the US, and you would have to look really hard to find any trace that these meetings ever took place in the US news.
No, my understanding is that Canadian report that you said was covered in the Canadian news, probably a pretty good report, because the media picked what some people would consider a relatively obscure issue and flagged it as the item, the federal backing of mortgages.
Yeah.
as I understand it, the American report was quite broad and quite damning. So you
Yeah.
would expect that to get attention, and it's curious that it wouldn't.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the fund showed a willingness to be very, very critical of the U.S. But even in the most recent report, there was a brief discussion about the debt ceiling, and they basically said, well, we think this will work itself out. And we know that it did work itself out, but not very well, and certainly not in the manner in which the fund would have liked.
Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to these country-by-country consultations, is there an overall report on the state of the global economy, or do they do any analysis on a regional basis?
Yeah, the fund realizes that what goes on in one country obviously has spillovers, so they're trying to also figure out ways to talk about regional issues as well as look at countries and their interconnectedness to one another. So this is a recent development in the fund the last couple of years. They've tried to look at this issue about how growth in China might affect growth in the US and conversely, to put the whole global picture together.
Mm-hmm. And who reads those reports?
I think that there's a whole lot of folks in the financial community that are very interested in those reports. But, to say that the average individual would read those reports, I think would be a bit of a stretch.
Very good. We'll be back again in a minute with Martin Edwards. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, transparency. As I understand it, these reports, until relatively recently, typically were not released.
That's right.
Publicly. They were consultations with governments and for the government's benefit.
Yes.
That's changing.
Yes. In '97, after the Asian financial crisis, the fund realized that if it had ways to discipline countries effectively a little more easily, countries that didn't borrow from it, then they might be less able to adopt policy reforms that throw the world in crisis. So in order to sort of ease that leverage, the decision was made to make these reports public. And so over the last...
Countries made that decision?
Yes, yeah.
Not the fund?
Well, the fund decided to let countries release these reports. So it is ultimately a decision of the country itself. And so very recently, the world has moved from being rather opaque about this aspect of surveillance to being rather transparent, so that all the countries in the OECD, all the developed countries, release these reports annually without fail.
And there means there are some countries that don't.
Yes, that's right. There are some.
Where are they and who are they? And
there are.
Should we care about those particular countries?
No, there are actually a G20 country that hadn't released reports until very recently was Saudi Arabia. Brazil hadn't started releasing reports until very recently. Argentina, right now, is not really talking to the fund about anything, so they're certainly not releasing reports about consultations that don't happen. So there are, important countries for the global economy that remain outside the ambit of this sort of zone of transparency.
Now, if I remember the 1998 Asian financial crisis, countries in the region tended to want to blame the IMF.
Yes.
Both for the crisis, in part for starting, but they also thought the IMF's policy recommendations made it all much, much worse.
Absolutely.
So in the press, the IMF came off as kind of a bad guy in that situation. So it's interesting that would lead to pressure for countries to be more transparent about their compliance with IMF advice.
Yeah, I mean, the advice, I think, is always something that is open to contestation. That, the fund looks at countries in a very orthodox sense and basically pushes for fiscal restraint consistently. Even in the developed world now, where we might say, gosh, we have lots of people out of work, it might be time for another sort of Keynesian boost. The fund tends not to value that a whole lot. So I think the value of surveillance in that sense is that it allows us to make the fund more accountable for the quality of the advice that it gives. I mean, if we had known more that the fund was pushing countries with poor banking regulations to liberalize their economies or liberalize their financial systems in '97, there would have been more pushback against that. Or if we had known more that it was going to tell countries with budget surpluses, like Korea had, that the problem with the Korean economy was excessive government spending, we would have been able to sort of nudge the fund in a different direction. So in a sense then, transparency has been a bit of a double-edged sword for the IMF. That it's been a way to discipline countries, but it's also been a way for folks with knowledge about a situation to be able to sort of take issue with the quality of the fund's advice.
Now, the response we've seen to the most recent financial crisis was pretty Keynesian. There's been quite a lot of stimulus.
Absolutely.
Does that mean that the fund has been irrelevant, or has it been changing its tune?
Well, it's sort of a moving target. The IMF has sort of backed off. It supported the stimulus in 2009. It has cautioned the developed countries to be a little more worried about debt. And so that obviously means there are distributional costs there because there are economic problems, namely unemployment and low growth, that we aren't solving. So I do think that that's sort of an issue that's very much in flux, but it's also in flux in the field of economics as a whole.
Now, you've studied why it is that countries are becoming more transparent. Why is it? What's driving this? What are the factors that seem to come into play?
Sure. There's a number of different mechanisms going on there. In one sense, it's sort of straightforward that wealthier countries are more willing to endure any downside costs, and so wealthier countries release these reports. Countries also respond to peer pressure, so they respond to pressure from what their neighbors do. But also one of the bigger factors that, one of the interesting factors for me as a political scientist, is that democratic governance sort of goes hand in hand with international transparency. And so that suggests, that politicians want the public to know about the state of the economy. They want to give that better quality information to them in the hopes that they'll make the right decision when they pull a lever on election day.
And are there a lot of cases where government's own financial self-assessments will be radically different from the IMF reports?
There are cases where the fund and the country do view things very differently. One of the reasons that Brazil has sort of stayed away from releasing these reports is that they had a number of disagreements on a number of fronts with IMF economists. And in some sense, those are sensible. It's basically, you guys come into town, every year for a couple of days. You don't really know what's going on here. We do, and we understand it a little better than you do. So that debate about advice is something that always happens. We saw this in Europe as well. What ought the European economies be doing? Developing more, putting more energy into putting people back to work, or focusing on slowing the growth of government spending.
So in the case of Brazil, would the difference be something like the IMF team comes in and says, you guys are borrowing and spending too much and you need to tighten up the operation, and the Brazilian view is the opposite, and so they just don't want to have to debate the IMF publicly?
Yeah, it's
not a question about the interpretation of data or the quality of data, because as I understand it, Brazil actually would supply quite a lot of the data to the IMF teams when they come in.
Yeah, it's about what lessons they gather from the data. One of the issues that the fund always sort of chides countries for are controls on the flow of external capital. The fund wants these economies to be open to the flow of money across borders. And Brazil's had a very recent experience with imposing controls on capital to make it harder to take it out of the country. They had sensible reasons for doing so, in their view. And the fund sort of chided them for creating the system, which is, in a sense, a violation of IMF rules.
And who had the better of that argument? Or is the jury still out?
Well, in a sense, I guess the Brazilians won the day because they said, we're not going to release this report, and that's fine.
And it hasn't hurt them in the marketplace, has it?
Exactly. No one thinks of Brazil as a basket case in any sense of the word.
Very good. We'll be back again in a minute with Martin Edwards. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So we've spoken about transparency and surveillance of the global economy and individual countries' economies. How much transparency is there in the IMF processes themselves, in the internal operations of what the IMF does? And is there pressure for more?
Well, interestingly, there's been some pressure to ratchet the level of transparency back in recent years, but thankfully that hasn't resulted in any changes.
Pressure from?
From a lot of countries that don't want the market to know about the findings of these reports.
Oh.
But again, thankfully, there's been a fair amount of pushback to that. The fund is a bit of an opaque institution, and it can be sort of a little daunting to navigate. It is getting more. It is becoming more transparent, but sometimes when you want to find basic information from them, it can be hard to figure out.
And do we know, for example, who these people are who are going country to country and writing reports, or is that unavailable information?
Their names always are attached to the report at the end. So they publicly, sign their name. And, that's a disciplining device for them to make sure that they actually do the work, and, don't go to the beach. So there's that mechanism. But ex ante, before the team arrives, it's very often folks from the regional desk.
We mentioned that a lot of the data they get for these reports are actually supplied by the countries that they're reporting on. How do we have confidence in the quality of those data, and do we have differing levels of confidence in the quality of those data depending on which country or which region we're talking about?
This is a bit of a problem, and importantly, it is a very silent problem. The fund treats numbers as sacrosanct, and it does raise the question, where do they come from? What the fund will do is present a series of projections based on based on what they know about where the economy is going to be in 3 years. Okay, and so it's easier to start with that than with we know nothing and that we're purely reliant on the country. But there have been plenty of cases in which countries have understated some numbers, overstated some numbers. Greece is the biggest example one can think of nowadays. But the scope of the problem, I really can't tell you, because this is, again, something, the fund, I would say, has an interest in keeping the scope of that problem quiet.
And are there any checks at all on this, or does it all show up in the form of risk premiums that investors wind up having to pay based on what they think about the quality of the reporting?
Yeah, I do think that these are largely priced into the market. Sometimes there will be an assessment after the fact. A couple of months later, there'll be a report that comes out in which the data at that time are radically different than what they could have ever been 3 months ago, and there's a correction, there's some sort of apology on the part of the country, and life goes on.
We see that all the time, routinely, from the United States, always revising its report figures, yes.
Yeah, and some of that is legitimate.
Right.
And some of it is certainly less so.
Right. Now, the IMF is not the only body involved in surveillance of the global economy.
That's right.
So who else does this, and how do they compare with the IMF in terms of how they do it or how well they do it?
Yeah. Well, in terms of economic, on sort of the economic side of the house, the OECD, which is an organization of large, developed democratic countries, also does this on a biannual basis. And what they look at is a whole lot more social issues than the fund does. The fund sort of focuses on strict macro. But the OECD has made a lot of suggestions about U.S. employment policy, for example, and how to get people back to work. Not just, well, you should put people back to work. And so there's been a lot of discussion about education and how we make it easier for people to transition from school to work.
And private sector surveillance?
Oh, there's absolutely scads of that going on at all sorts of different levels as well.
And it more or less relies on the same kind of data that the IMF rely on?
Yes, to some extent. A lot of Wall Street firms or country risk firms will take the Article 4 as their starting point.
Right.
And so it sort of raises the question about how much more they actually know than the fund.
Now, one of the things the IMF was set up to do was to help countries deal with short-term liquidity crises and backup loans and so on. Mm-hmm. So how much does the lending and the backstopping function of the IMF affect the surveillance function? Are they sort of tightly integrated, flip sides of the same coin, or are they largely independent activities?
They're interconnected, and it of course raises a problem. You know, if you're lending to a country, you're not going to be that critical about what's going on there. And so this is a bit of a challenge when we think, because we want the fund to give a full and accurate accounting of the state of the economy. But when it is effectively an investor, you can absolutely see this, that in the tone of the reports, is that the reports tend to be more glowing in countries that are under IMF programs.
That's interesting, because I would think an investor would want to crack the whip and make sure that the country got its house in order.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we want the fund to be tough, and of course it is ultimately, because it will sort of hold back installments of the loan if there's not a whole lot of policy reform. But you do get a strong sense from reading surveillance documents for countries that are under IMF programs that it's more of a see how good we're doing document than it is a full and clear accounting.
That's interesting. So how political is this process? Is there a way to get a sense of that?
You can look, and it's no accident that countries that are larger tend to have more glowing reports than countries that are smaller. If the country is a U.S. ally, there's some evidence that it has more beneficial evaluations. So there are kind of geopolitical threads that run through this, just as there are in lending.
Well, very interesting. Well, we'll be back one more time with Martin Edwards. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So how would you like to see all this change? If you could design a surveillance regime for the global economy, what would you suggest, and what specific things would you like, not necessarily just the fund to do differently, but the countries, civil society actors, other institutions, private sector actors? How would this work better?
I think the future lies in more engagement across the board. I think more discussion about what the fund is looking at and not looking at, I think, would be very helpful. We'd like to steer, the fund so that it is helpful in some areas and not in others, and so we'd like it to be more detailed often. Saying you need to cut the budget. Okay, fine. That makes sense insofar as it's the province and national policymakers to figure out how to do that. But more detailed advice would be helpful. Constructive experiences of other countries as they might bear on the challenges that a country faces. So basically allowing for a little more learning, I think, would also be very helpful. The other thing that needs to happen is there needs to be more engagement by the fund in the countries themselves. The recent Canadian consultation's gotten a lot of press, but in the U.S., one would be hard-pressed to see evidence that these are ever discussed. Even in 2010, when we were debating the need for a debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling, the Article 4 team was in D.C. at the very same time, and you didn't see any evidence. This was discussed, the results were discussed at Capitol Hill or by the White House. So there needs to be a whole lot more integration on the part of the fund with civil society, so that as people know about the policy prescriptions that are being in there, then they can mobilize elected officials to close the loop on reforms.
Is the fund doing a bad job of signaling its own relevance and importance?
I think the fund sometimes is always in need of thinking about how to make this work. And they pride themselves on having a very lean organization and not a lot of staff. And I think if you think about that from more of a marketing standpoint, they need to make more ties to civil society. That does push the fund in different ways, and I think they sort of naturally want to stay away from that.
And who, if anybody, is actually holding the fund's feet to the fire? It doesn't sound like it's the press.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like it's the member governments who, from what I can tell from what you've said, happy to use the fund as they can for their own benefit, but they're not necessarily trying to make sure the fund is performing particularly well.
Yeah.
Is it academics?
There's a little, there's a little bit of work, done by academics as we write and think about this stuff. There's a lot of work done by NGOs to try to sort of steer the fund so that it becomes, creates those levels of engagement. But there's no one actor that we could point to here. It's all non-state stuff.
But the NGOs that would do this, would I be wrong to think that they're probably going to be more progressive in terms of their politics and their economics?
No, that's true.
And the IMF is going to be more conservative.
That's right.
Which could just conceivably generate a standoff. It's not clear that that's going to be a healthy and constructive dialogue.
Well, that is certainly true. But if we look at the world today, the fund is lending in Europe and largely only in Europe. And so they have to sort of think like where are the challenges going to be, and how do they ultimately get leverage for policy reform in countries in which it gets harder for them to get policy reform because these folks are fund clients themselves. They hold the purse strings. So there is an imperative on their part for more engagement. They might not like what they want to hear, but that's the whole point of this process, right? The fund gives countries advice it doesn't want to hear. That makes every bit of sense that civil society should give that advice right back.
And what about investors? Do they hold the fund's feet to the fire?
Investors, jump on these statements and they use them as a signal. They're a ready signal about countries' creditworthiness. We see that markets do respond to the release of this data, however anodyne or boring we might find that. So there's certainly value on that sense. It's definitely true in emerging markets. Whether that's also true in advanced industrial economies is quite a different question, because after all, they have multiple sources of information. They have, their own sources of economic forecasts. So the demand in that sense for the fund's information is not as great.
And would you say there's a governance gap when it comes to surveillance of the global economy? And if so, who's best positioned to fill that gap? Or do we need to think creatively about building new governance mechanisms to do that?
Well, I think it raises the question there as, well, who's going to do the governing of the governance mechanism that we create, right? We live in a world in which we have great powers who are going to push these organizations around, like it or not. And so I do think, again, there's sort of a healthy role for civil society to play, or at least civil society might have many drawbacks, but at least it's politically neutral and it's not willing to make the IMF a tool of any one country's foreign policy. But it's interested in changing the dialogue and changing the tone of the debate. And that's what's needed here.
What about the G8 or the G20? Can they take this up?
The G20 intermittently discusses IMF surveillance. There's been a bit, there's been discussions about how to make this more transparent or make these messages more clear. But at the same time, there's a double-edged sword there, because those same countries don't really want those reports that come out that say that the U.S. budget is spiraling out of control or things like that. They want a little bit of flexibility, and so that means they're not the ready voice for policy reform here.
You mentioned that the IMF is largely lending to Europe now, and Europe seems to be where all the action is in terms of inventing governance to deal with major economic crises. Is the IMF being eclipsed by new European mechanisms to govern lending and shoring up failing economies and disciplining public policy?
I think in a sense that the fund would like to get out of Europe as much as possible and leave them to do it. But I think it's a region of the world that can support. The fund only provides a third of the money to the Eurozone. That they can support more of it, and they should support more of it, because it's part of regulating that common currency.
Right, and how about 30 to 50 years down the road when China is the world's largest economy? How do you see all of this changing?
Well, China has an interest in surveillance because they want some mechanism to be able to give advice to the U.S., right? They have an interest in steering reforms in the U.S. So they think that surveillance is important. And even in discussions about, an Asian monetary fund, there's also sort of a discussion about, well, we need to have a surveillance mechanism in it. So, the relative rankings of the powers might change, but the imperative of surveillance remains the same.
Very good. Well, thanks for coming in and teaching me a lot, and I hope the audience would agree that it's a rich subject and an important one that I at least didn't know that much about. So I appreciate you coming in and helping me untangle it. And to our audience, thank you for joining us, and please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Various international economic crises. But your specialty is more surveillance of the global economy, and I think many people don't fully understand the range of functions the IMF performs, some of which are quite different from the reason the IMF was created. So if you can back it up for us a little bit and just say, what the IMF started out as, what it's morphed into, and why it's still important.
Sure, absolutely. One of the functions the fund was created to do was to be a backstop for lending, but also to provide surveillance for countries. When they needed loans, they could get policy advice. Now, since the 1940s, that has morphed into an annual
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Martin Edwards on surveillance of the global economy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome every week here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, some noted expert on some important issue on the global agenda. Today I'm happy to welcome Martin Edwards, who is Associate Professor in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University, and this year visiting Fulbright Research Fellow at the Balsley School and at CIGI. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. And Martin, you're an expert on international political economy and specifically on the IMF. So I would like to talk to you quite a bit about the IMF. But let's first contextualize it. We've done some podcasts in the past here about the IMF and mostly about IMF reform and the role of the IMF, for example.
Ritual, effectively, wherein fund teams go to each country and they essentially issue a report card about the country's economy. And that report card will talk about economic forecasts, it will talk about some potential areas of risk, and it will inevitably make some policy recommendations. And so what's interesting is that increasingly a lot of this work is now publicly available, which is a stark contrast to the early 90s, in which this ritual process unfolded in a very opaque fashion.
So the surveillance itself took the form of a report written by IMF staffers. And who would these people be? Would they be economists? Would they be policy analysts?
They'd be almost exclusively economists.
Right.
And so they're sent to sort of get a sense of where the country is and where the country is going.
And what do they look at? It's fiscal policy, monetary policy, markets, regulation, what kinds of things?
It's an assortment of things, actually. I mean, the fund's main focus is the balance of payments, but that inevitably involves discussions about fiscal policy and monetary policy as it pertains to the balance of payments. There's a whole host of sort of social issues or regulatory issues that the fund tends not to talk about. It will talk about unemployment occasionally, but its main focus